Welcome back to my channel. Today's creepy story of a Belgian newlywed couple. The newlyweds are spending their honeymoon in Corsica, a picturesque, mountainous island that is famous for its beautiful beaches and magnificent landscapes. In this enchanting scenery, a tragic event takes place for the young couple. After some time, it comes to light that 3 years earlier, in a village located as far as 1,400 kilometers away, another young couple had almost exactly the same thing happen to them, and the two incidents are closely connected. Belgian police are working on a case that goes deep into the past and is even more complicated than it seemed. On May 11, 1995, at around 2 o'clock in the morning, emergency services are called to an accident that occurred near the village of Calvi in France, Upper Corsica department. A tearful young woman is sitting by the side of the road, which at that very point runs over a bay. One of the firefighters is the first to appear by her side. The woman, flooded in tears, begs for help for her husband and just repeats over and over again that this is their honeymoon. The firefighter manages with difficulty to get basic information out of her. She and her husband were on a small excursion, after which they had dinner at a restaurant and headed back to their hotel in Calvi. The husband was behind the wheel. At some point, an animal ran across their path. The driver wanted to pass it and swerved slightly. He then lost control of the vehicle, and the car began to slide down the cliff directly into the water. The woman managed to get out of the car sliding down the cliff. Her husband did not. She tried to climb down to rescue him but was unsuccessful, so she went back to call for help. The firefighter knows this road very well. It is winding and very dangerous, especially at night, which is why accidents often happen here. The man still tries to ask about the details of the incident, but the woman starts crying hysterically, and after a while she faints. She is immediately taken to the Calvi hospital. The services are constantly working at the scene of the accident. Conducting searches in these conditions is extremely difficult as the slope is very steep and rocky, and reinforcements and additional specialized equipment have to be brought in. Over the next few hours, officers try to find the car along with the driver. They finally succeed. As it turns out, the car has fallen 140 meters down, lying at the foot of the cliff. The vehicle has broken into 2 parts and is completely destroyed. It is obvious that the driver could not have survived, however, there is no body anywhere. So in the morning, divers begin to search the waters of the bay. After 5 hours of work, at a depth of 3 meters, they find the body of a man. It lies 50 meters from where the car wreck was found. Police arrive at the Calvi hospital and question the young widow. The woman's name is Aurore Martin. She is 25 years old and from Belgium. Marc van Beers, her tragically deceased husband, was 36 years old. The couple was just 2 months into their marriage. The young widow repeats to officers the same thing she said during the night. Corsican police are not digging into the matter or asking for details. The accident may seem a bit strange. It's hard to explain why the body ended up in the water, but there are no other witnesses, so one has to accept what the miraculously rescued young woman, apparently heartbroken over the loss of her recently married husband, says. The police put the case away for the records, and the victim's corpse is taken back to his native Belgium. Marc van Beers' parents are shocked by the news of his death, but at the same time, they can't help thinking that there is something vague and disturbing about it all. They feel as if they sensed this tragedy. In any case, they remember very well that from the beginning they were very worried that this marriage would end very badly for their son. When Marc introduced his partner to them over a year ago, they were very surprised. He and Aurore were like 2 different poles. The quiet and shy Marc, slightly overweight and, some said, with the appearance of a typical intellectual, was a complete incompatibility with Aurore, who was 11 years younger, attractive, confident, and brimming with energy. Other people around him also had a similar impression of a complete incompatibility. Marc came from a very wealthy family, was a lawyer, and had a brilliant career as a tax consultant. His partner, on the other hand, had no education or profession, and didn't even try to hide the fact that her most enjoyable activity was spending money. Marc's acquaintances also knew that he had met Aurore through an intermediary agency. He chose to do so because he was completely unsuccessful at making contacts with women. In the ad, he stated that he was looking for an attractive partner to start a family with her. Aurore responded to this ad, writing outright that she was looking for a wealthy man by whose side she could live a comfortable life. Marc was deaf and blind to all criticism and could not see the world beyond his new partner. This one, by the way, came to Brussels right away and moved into his elegant home, and after a few months, the two began preparations for a wedding and a lavish wedding reception. The celebration took place on March 11, 1995. Marc died exactly 2 months later. After the funeral, the Van Beers family's doubts and suspicions grow, especially after the young widow literally cuts off contact with them overnight. To top it off, several weeks later, Marc's parents learn that Aurore has sold the house she inherited from her husband. They then decide that they will engage a lawyer to investigate their son's suspicious accident. The lawyer manages to get a glimpse of the records relating to the incident. There is some information there that draws his particular attention: the lack of brake marks at the scene of the accident, and the fact that Aurore had only a few scratches on her body. This is very strange because first, as she testified, she jumped out of the moving car, and then, looking for her husband, she moved down and up a steep slope. The lawyer files a notice of possible crime. In June 1996, a year after the accident, Brussels police launch an investigation to clarify the circumstances surrounding the death of Belgian national Marc van Beers in Corsica. The young widow, who travels a lot, happens to be in Brussels, and after the first summons, she appears for questioning. The commissioner interviewing her, however, is not content with a vague description of what happened before the accident itself, but digs into each detail. Aurore's explanations are so vague and inconsistent that it results in the investigating judge ordering the exhumation of the corpse. During the examination of Marc's corpse, the pathologist finds numerous rib fractures and the presence of multiple wounds on the right side of the body, including on the victim's head. Among them, a wound above the right ear, measuring about 12 centimeters in length, draws particular attention. This wound, especially given the nature of the other injuries, looks as if it was caused by a very hard blow from a hard object. The pathologist is unable to give a specific cause of death, but the section provides another key piece of information. Most of the wounds on Marc's body were not made until after his death. This puts the case in a completely different light. It is now certain that Marc did not die in an accident, but was the victim of a crime. The section provides another important finding. Marc's stomach was empty, which means that the man had not eaten anything in at least several hours before his death. This fact is contradicted by the testimony of his wife, who told police that they had both been in a restaurant before the accident. For investigators, therefore, this is evidence that Aurore was lying. However, all this is not enough to accuse her in court of involvement in the murder of her husband, so the police officers have to collect more evidence. A traffic accident expert is sent to Corsica. He is to inspect the scene, confront his observations with the post-accident documentation, and try to clarify the case on this basis. The task is not easy, since the vehicle wreck no longer exists, and there are virtually no photos from the accident. However, based on an inspection of the scene, the specialist draws several conclusions. First, if one sticks to Aurore's testimony, the car, having fallen down, should have ended up in a place a little farther away, not where it was discovered by the services. The young widow also claimed that Marc began braking violently. However, as the family's lawyer has already pointed out, the service documentation says there were no signs of braking. The Belgian specialist unequivocally states that if the driver had indeed braked, then on the ground, which, as here, consists mainly of sand and cones, such traces would have had to be preserved and would have been noticeable. The expert concludes that the car was deliberately pushed down. In his opinion, it is also unlikely that Aurore jumped out of the car before it even began to roll into the abyss. Admittedly, the car was moving at a relatively low speed at that moment, about 35 kilometers per hour, but also at such a speed, it is impossible to simply jump out of a moving vehicle. In Belgium, experts reconstruct the incident on the runway and prove that leaving a vehicle moving at 35 kilometers per hour is impossible. It is also ruled out at a much lower speed, especially considering that the person jumping out of the car would not have been injured as a result. The findings are therefore as follows. Marc was fatally beaten. His body was thrown into the car, after which the vehicle with the body was pushed down the slope. At the bottom, the body was pulled out and thrown into the water. Another detail is important. Aurore would not have been able to do it alone, so it is certain that she had accomplices, and at least 2 of them. Investigators discover that after her husband's death, Aurore Martin pocketed a sum of more than $500,000 then current dollars from several different life insurance policies, as well as an amount of about $150,000 from the sale of her husband's house. They are also obtaining evidence that Aurore forged Marc's signature on one of the policies, and the circumstances of her husband's accident were not investigated at all by the Corsican police, despite comments made after the incident by members of the emergency services. There is already enough circumstantial evidence against Aurore that investigators are ready to question her and possibly even detain her for 48 hours. Meanwhile, it turns out that the widow has disappeared. She told friends that she was going to visit her uncle living in the U.S., but unfortunately, the search yields nothing. Aurore Martin has vanished. 2 years have just passed since Marc's death, when an investigating judge issues an international letter of inquiry for the young widow. Weeks pass, and she still cannot be traced. The investigation comes to a standstill, and the only change that occurs in the case is that information about the mysterious 1995 accident makes its way into the Belgian and French media. As it turns out, however, this changes everything. The Brussels commissioner in charge of the case is approached by Fabienne L., who says she is the former partner of Aurore Martin's father, and, after reading the media, decided to shed light on what she knows about the death of his son-in-law. Fabienne says that immediately after the accident, she visited Aurore in the hospital where she was lying for observation. It was then that the widow whispered in her ear, "I am rich. I committed the perfect crime. Together with Peter, we killed my husband." Aurore then added that she and her lover Peter had lured Marc into a trap by deception, on the route that Aurore was supposed to take with her husband. At an agreed place, Peter had placed his car across the road. He did it in such a way that she and Marc had to stop. When this happened, her lover and his buddies attacked her husband with baseball bats. Marc reportedly still shouted, "Please don't do anything to my wife. Please let her go." In an interview with the commissioner, Fabienne stresses that she did not comment or ask anything because she was simply afraid. She adds that Aurore's lover, called Peter Uwe Schmidt, is German, and Aurore has been in a relationship with him for several years. The name Peter Uwe Schmidt is being heard by investigators in Brussels for the first time, but after checking the data registry, it turns out that the man was suspected of being involved in his wife's fatal accident several years earlier. He was eventually convicted only of manslaughter. However, police attention is now drawn to the fact that that accident was almost identical to the one in which Marc died. Thus, it is apparent that the whole case goes deep into the past and is even more complicated than it seemed. The police gradually gather various data, moving on many leads simultaneously, and this several weeks of antsy work makes it possible to reconstruct the events from the very beginning. Peter Uwe Schmidt and Aurore Martin met at the exclusive bar Le Golden in Luttich, Belgium, in 1990. Aurore performed there as a stripper, but made no secret of the fact that she also performs sexual services for a fee. Frequent guests at the bar were soldiers stationed at the NATO headquarters near Mons. One of them was PFC Peter Uwe Schmidt. In the unit, Peter also served as a driver who drove generals around. Only later did it come to light that at the time, the young man was stealing luxury cars while taking part in insurance extortion. There was an immediate spark between Aurore and Peter. They even turned out to be made for each other. Both dreamed of big money and a lavish life, and both were ready to do anything to achieve it. Together, they hatched a diabolical plan. Each of them would marry someone, then take out as much life insurance as possible, and then murder the wife or husband. The insurance payout would allow them to accumulate wealth. Peter was the first to act. In November 1991, at the Duding Disco in Waterloo, Belgium, Peter accosted 22-year-old Ursula Deschamps, a literature student. Modest and quiet, Ursula immediately lost her head for the very handsome and charming German. She moved in with him just a week after they met, and 3 months later, against the advice of Ursula's horrified parents, the couple married. Soon after, the young couple took out bilateral life insurance. Shortly after the honeymoon, Peter showed his true face. Ursula began to catch him flirting and having affairs. She also quickly noticed that her husband was involved in some shady business, including car theft and insurance fraud. She kept finding huge sums of cash in the house and documents that looked obviously forged. Peter began beating his wife, and it got to the point where Ursula was repeatedly asking her sister to visit her, as she was simply afraid to be alone with her husband. 6 months after her marriage, Ursula moved out of the house. She intended to get a divorce, but Peter would not agree to it. Then she threatened him that she would report some of his activities to the police, specifically several car thefts. She was to report to the station on September 1st. By arranging this date, Ursula wanted to put pressure on her husband and thus force him to agree to the divorce. She didn't have time to do so, because 3 days earlier, on the evening of August 29, 1992, she was killed in an accident. The couple was driving on a country road near Mans. Peter was behind the wheel. He was the one who later told police that at some point he lost control of the vehicle and their Mazda convertible fell into the canal. Peter managed to exit the car at the last moment, but his wife was unable to save herself. Her body was not found until 4 days later, lying in the water about 800 meters below where the car had fallen into the water. Ursula's parents didn't believe in the accident, especially since their daughter was an excellent swimmer. She was a lifeguard and had many awards and medals. They couldn't understand why she didn't save herself if she got out of the car. They also didn't understand what reason it was that on that particular day and in such beautiful weather, the convertible had the roof closed, especially since their son-in-law practically always drove with the roof open. The police agreed that there were many ambiguities in the case, but that's where it ended. Peter was convicted of manslaughter. He received a suspended 3-month prison sentence and a small fine. After the trial ended, he paid the insurance money, in the amount of about $176,000 at the time, left the Bundeswehr, and flew to Miami, Florida. The police officers investigating Marc's case now know that Aurore was already waiting for Peter in a luxury apartment at the time. For roughly 2 years, the pair of lovers led a luxurious life, and when cash reserves began to run low, it was time for Aurore to keep her word and look around for a potential victim. The search did not take long. The woman soon found an ad by Marc van Beers and wrote to him. The investigation into Marc's death continues, with police also issuing an arrest letter for Peter. Investigators are certain that he, as presented by Fabienne, was involved in the murder of Marc. Of course, the almost twin similarities of the two accidents are striking. The unclear cause of the incident, the miraculous rescue of one person, the body of the other found outside the car wreck. But according to Belgian law, no one can be convicted twice for the same thing, so it is clear that Aurore's lover will only be able to answer for complicity in Marc's murder. However, Peter Uwe Schmidt has also disappeared. Belgian police do what they can to find the wanted individuals. When information emerges that they are hiding in Miami, they manage to involve the FBI in the case. It is already known that Peter and Aurore are extremely cautious, trying to leave no trace. If they have to split up, if only for a few hours, and then somehow get in touch, they communicate by phone, using only phone booths, which they keep changing. But thanks to hard investigative work, FBI personnel managed to track down these payphones. In October 1997, Peter is arrested while trying to use a phone booth in Miami near the airport. The man is carrying $50,000 in cash. He tries, incidentally, to give it to police officers as a bribe. Aurore, who is waiting for Peter that evening at their rented apartment in a Miami suburb, is also arrested. A year later, the couple's extradition to Belgium takes place. The two are accused of murdering Marc van Beers. During the trial, they do not admit their guilt and keep changing versions of events. Because of this, they ultimately fail to clarify several important issues, such as who their accomplices were or when exactly Marc was killed. However, a whole chain of clues and circumstantial evidence makes it possible to prove their guilt. In 2001, Peter Uwe Schmidt is sentenced to 20 years in prison for murder, and Aurore Martin to 15 years for complicity in murder. Current sources say that Aurore Martin left prison as early as 2007, and Peter Uwe Schmidt a year later. Upon his release, he was immediately deported to Germany. Reportedly, a condition of his release was a ban on maintaining contact with Aurore. It is also known that he was denied entry to Belgium in 2017. Belgian media revisit the case once in a while, and in comments on the case, internet users always emphasize how appalling it is that the murderers were able to go free so quickly. Thanks for listening to this story. Goodbye and stay safe.